Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video today I'm going to be looking at President Johnson in terms of maintaining America as a world power. So essentially this is looking at his foreign policy, in particular his escalation of the Vietnam War. Now this is part of my series on American history from 1945 to 1980 and it's designed for this A-level specification 2Q from AQA. And we're looking at Johnson's presidency, and this particular part of the specification says maintaining American world power, escalation of the war in Vietnam, relations between the USA and its Western allies. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have a look at those two aspects. The escalation of the war in Vietnam is obviously the most significant part of this. So Johnson's initial instinct was not to escalate the war at all. He wanted to avoid sending US troops and believed that increased intervention was unpopular. And he actually campaigned on a peace platform in 1964. I mean, he generally believed that the USA shouldn't be sending their boys to fight and die when actually this should be done by the nations in Asia. He did, however, feel bound to continue the policies of Kennedy, and this somewhat restricted his options, particularly due to Kennedy's administration's involvement in the assassination of Diem and Johnson's commitment to follow these policies to avoid the loss of Vietnam, and this kind of tied him to continued involvement, and the level of US involvement at the time wasn't being effective. It wasn't working. Therefore, the next logical step really was escalation or withdrawal. Now, because, and again, we're very much bound by Kennedy's legacy. He didn't want to withdraw. He didn't want to stop what Kennedy had started. He didn't really want to escalate, but that turns out to be kind of the only real option. There is a large amount of continuity from what had gone before. So the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, stayed in place. Dean Rusk remained Secretary of State. And you've got George Bundy as the National Security Advisor. We also see the appointment of General Westmoreland to command military operations, and this would prove significant in the move to escalation, as Westmoreland, again, very much pushed US policy in that general direction and kept on asking for more troops and more intervention. The kind of catalyst really for pushing Johnson further down the line of escalation was the Tonkin incidents. So Johnson's administration had remained committed to assisting the South Vietnamese. This was demonstrated by a National Security Agency memorandum in 63, then escalated in 64 with memorandum calling for more use of force. So again, Johnson's maintaining Kennedy's commitment to supporting the South Vietnamese against the communists in North Vietnam. In August 64, there was some US ships on an espionage mission that were attacked in North Vietnamese waters. And Congress then passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving Johnson the ability to take all necessary steps due to this unprovoked attack. And I put unprovoked in inverted commas because these were US spy ships in North Vietnamese waters, really unprovoked. The resolution received almost total bipartisan support. I think there's 2 Democrat senators, I think, vote against it, and that's it. So it really is Johnson in line with the views of America at this point in terms of looking to move the war, or to escalate the war at this point. Everything was in place for that escalation. Johnson's role here is quite controversial. I mean, was he planning escalation already? And Tonkin is just an excuse. And you can say, well, there's already those 2 memorandums in 63 and 64. The second one of which calls for use of more force, and so is Tonkin just an excuse? Is he simply responding to Republican criticism that he was being soft on communism? Did he hold back information about the espionage the ships were undertaking? Therefore, again, maybe getting that kind of resounding support in Congress that he might not otherwise have done. It's very difficult for us to say what his absolute motivation was. The bit about responding to criticism does seem to fit to an extent, because his approval ratings shoot up at this point, and escalation took place. So whatever the motivation behind it, the escalation definitely does then rise significantly after Tonkin, whether it is the catalyst or the decision had already been made, and what Johnson's motivation was. We then get this next stage, which is referred to as rolling thunder. Now, a working group was set up to look at the situation in Vietnam and suggested policies going forward. It pointed to the weakness of the Saigon government in South Vietnam. It reiterated the fears of the domino theory, where this idea that if Vietnam falls, then there could be a domino effect in Southeast Asia. And it suggested that the way forward was heavy bombing of North Vietnam. And this then came to fruition, where following the attack on an American camp near Pleiku in February '65, Johnson ordered this program of rolling thunder. In the next 3 years, 864,000 tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam. However, it didn't cause the level of disruption that was hoped for. And rather than crushing North Vietnamese morale, it actually provided them with great propaganda for them to use themselves in their war, but also communist propaganda to be used across the developing world against Vietnam, in the Cold War, to push this idea of American imperialism and aggression. And it's not a great optic. North Vietnamese villages getting bombed from the sky by this kind of high-tech modern military. On top of this, Johnson doesn't actually officially declare war, in part fearful of the impact this might have on the funding of the Great Society. If the economist goes, oh, we're on the war footing, that's where we put all our money, we're not going to put it into your domestic policies. Having said that, rolling thunder was popular in the US, but it wasn't effective. And with the popularity, it's worth noting, I mean, although the optics are really bad, what we're not going to see, yes, is in the enormous American losses, which will come later, because this is a policy which is dropping bombs from the sky, and therefore it is kind of, from the US point of view, they were hoping for big impact with minimal risk, but it doesn't work. And so we get further escalation, and the further escalation involves the sending of ground troops. Now, Westmoreland, I mentioned earlier, pushed the idea of escalation, and we see him demanding greater protection for bomber bases near Da Nang. On the 8th of March 1965, 3,500 Marines landed with orders to only shoot if fired upon. So again, this is very different to stuff that we'll see later. On the 3rd of April, 2 Marine battalions, one Marine air squadron, and about 20,000 logistical support personnel were deployed, and they could be deployed in what we refer to as search and destroy missions. And so we are seeing an escalation here in terms of number of boots on the ground, but also in terms of what the orders to those men are. So it starts off with only shoot if you're fired upon, and that moves to search and destroy. So a significant escalation there. So from here, the number of US troops in Vietnam would grow to 250,000 in 2 years later, to 548,000 by the end of 1968. So we are seeing very, very significant escalation of ground troops. Westmoreland believed that a policy of attrition would be successful. However, the images captured by the media of modern weaponry being used against poor villagers proved to be an absolute propaganda disaster, and also you can see that the idea of an attritional war against an opposition that not only knew the terrain but used guerrilla tactics, and then melted away into the village populations, was ineffective. So Westmoreland here maybe gets the policy wrong. And again, one of the big issues overall, we need to probably think about analysing the kind of essays you might get asked on this. You might be able to analyse Johnson's role in all of this. well, is this all Johnson's fault, or is this, or does some of the fault lie with the generals and the advisors? Is he getting bad advice, essentially? Also, there is an argument that what happens is that the media kind of plucks defeat from the jaws of victory, in terms of the way that the media portrays what's happening in Vietnam turns the American population against the war, and that has a significant impact. Now, Johnson appears to be stuck between the hawks and the doves. Now, the hawks are groups, particularly in Congress, who want a much more aggressive policy, and they're determined to kind of snuff out communism, and they're fearful of the domino effect, and they want America to play a strong role, and they want therefore to escalate and put more and more military resources into winning at Vietnam. The doves want to negotiate. They want to take a more softer point, more consensual point, and Johnson seems to be neither one. He doesn't seem to be an absolute dove, or although he's vice president does. He doesn't seem to be an absolute hawk, but he had up until this point kind of carried out some quite hawkish behaviour, and we wonder whether this was because at the point when he did it earlier on, it was popular. From this point onwards, it will turn to be unpopular. And Johnson became increasingly unpopular, especially due to the advent of the draft. The next significant event we're going to look at is the Tet Offensive. Now, this was launched early in 1968 during the Tet Festival, traditionally a time of a holiday truce between the two sides of Vietnam. It's a significant offensive, and it showed the ability of the communist forces to work even within Saigon, and they actually took control of the US embassy in Saigon for 6 hours. Now, in terms of propaganda and the way this is perceived, is a hugely damaging blow for the US, because the US embassy is US soil, and this means US soil has been taken away. Much of the fighting took place in a place called Hue, where around half the houses were destroyed. You can see some images above. Around 4,000 Americans, 5,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, about 14,000 Vietnamese civilians, and about 60,000 communist soldiers were killed. It does beg the question, really, why the Tet Offensive is seen as such a massive victory, in inverted commas, for the North Korean communists, when those numbers suggest that they were on the wrong side of what took place. But it's seen as a victory for North Vietnam because it turned many of the US public against the war, showed clearly that the US wasn't close to winning, rather than making huge inroads into North Vietnam. They were seeing the embassy being taken and fighting in Hue and things like that. And amongst all this, and Johnson ends up not standing in the '68 election. He gets challenged, steps aside, and the kind of the protest movements and things at this time. But there's the famous kind of chant of "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" being kind of chanted in the streets in the US. So although the Tet Offensive doesn't look particularly effective in terms of the cost in terms of the communist soldiers, it does have an enormous impact on public opinion back in the US, and therefore further down the line leads to it is one of the starting points of the movement towards the US withdrawal. Another key event taking place at the same time is that the Khe Sanh base. So Khe Sanh base was on the North Vietnamese border. From this base, the US military had patrolled the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but it was then subject at this point to a 75-day siege by about 20,000 men. The US dropped about 80,000 tons of bombs to try and break the siege. Westmoreland, at this point, again, we're talking about him in his aggressive policies, went as far to suggest a tactical nuclear strike, which was rejected, and Westmoreland was replaced. The siege was broken, but the base was then closed down. US retreat was kept secret back home for as long as possible, but the North Vietnamese used the victory as great propaganda. And again, we can see here Vietnam is destroying the popularity of Johnson, who, as I've said, withdrew from the presidential race in '68. 1968 is a hugely significant year in US history as well. We see the assassinations of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. And we're seeing here really a kind of a collapse of Democrat power. They'd not done well in the midterms in '66, and really the support for Johnson and the war was really ebbing away. And with this, we kind of get to a point of thinking about, well, what's the wider context of this? Well, what kind of impact is this having on US relations with its Western allies? Well, the special relationship with Britain was souring. We again, Wilson's left in a very difficult position in the UK, where he doesn't want to speak out against the war and further damage relations with the US, because it's going to, I think he says something like, you don't kick your creditors in the balls. The UK was heavily reliant on US money at this point, and equally the Americans were annoyed. Wilson wasn't showing full support, so he wasn't criticising publicly, but he wasn't stepping in. Wilson was having to do a difficult balancing act. There was anti-Vietnam protests in the UK as well, where a lot of the Labour movement were demanding that he should speak out against US action in Vietnam. There was a very ardent kind of denouncer of US policy, however, in Europe, which was Charles de Gaulle, the leader of France. He denounced US policy in Vietnam, that was most notably in a speech in Cambodia. He called it unjust and a detestable war, and again he pointed to the comparative strength of the two sides, and this really does look like a big powerful nation bullying a poor small one, and that reflects on all the negative propaganda and media coverage that we've seen. So the US media is pointing this out. The North Vietnamese communists are using this as propaganda, and de Gaulle's kind of going, well, this is a really bad look. He had warned Kennedy against involvement in Vietnam. So Vietnam had been a French colony before this, and the French had massive problems with Vietnam. He'd warned Kennedy about getting involved. De Gaulle stayed in contact with George Ball, who was the Under Secretary of State, and de Gaulle and Ball presented some of de Gaulle's arguments against escalation in '64 to Johnson, but Johnson didn't follow them. Johnson and the US then suffered some kind of real strong criticism for Charles de Gaulle in a kind of the wider sense from this as well. So de Gaulle argued the US was too preoccupied with Asia to offer proper leadership in Europe, and therefore sought to take on this leadership. And we see them, for example, trying to separate Western Germany from the US. They vetoed the UK joining the EEC in 1967. Largely because they thought of the UK as the US's lapdog, really, and that they would be like a Trojan horse inside the EEC, promoting American ideals rather than European ones. And even more significantly in this, before this, in '66, Charles de Gaulle had gone as far as to pull France out of NATO. So Vietnam is having a significantly damaging impact on the US's relationship with its Western allies. We also see the fact that very few other countries contributed troops to the war effort. I mean, I think the most notable was South Korea. There are some troops from other places, troops in number from Australia and New Zealand. But essentially what this shows is the weakness of SEATO, so this idea of kind of collective security in Southeast Asia, where it really does largely look like the US is acting alone. So in both that area and back in Europe, America isn't receiving the support from its allies that it would necessarily have wanted and hoped for. And again, this starts to suggest that what's going on with the Vietnam War is very damaging to the US and has been very, very damaging to Johnson. And we've seen other videos we've done, look at his idea of his great society. He had this huge dream of what he wanted to do domestically, I guess massively undermined by all the money going into the war effort, and means again that he doesn't then go for his second term because largely of the unpopularity due to the Vietnam War. I hope that's been helpful for you. Again, if you like it, please hit the like button. If you've got any comments or questions, please ask them below. If you haven't subscribed to Alan History Nerd, then please do. So there's a whole series of videos on this topic, on US history. There's also loads on US politics and UK politics. There's other history topics covered as well, mostly the Tudors, making of modern Britain, Tsarist and communist Russia. So lots of other stuff on there. So if you haven't subscribed, please do check it all out. Thank you very much for watching.